The subcommittee on space will come to order. Good morning. Welcome to today's hearing entitled NASA Infrastructure Enabling Discovery and Ensuring Capability. In front of you are packets containing the written testimony, biographies, and required truth and testimony disclosures for today's witnesses. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. The purpose of today's hearing is to address NASA's complex infrastructure issues. This is a tall order for an agency that is the 9th largest federal government real property holder. That includes an inventory of more than 124,000 acres and more than 44 million square feet within approximately 4,900 buildings and other structures. However, nearly 80% of the agency's facilities date back to the Apollo era and are 40 or more years old. A 2012 study by NASA estimated that NASA may have as many as 865 unneeded facilities, with maintenance costs of over $24 million a year. Also, NASA has a backlog of over $2.19 billion in deferred maintenance. In order to better manage its infrastructure and facilities, NASA has established an agency master plan to align its infrastructure with its mission and set up a technical capabilities assessment study to identify and evaluate center capabilities against agency needs. Also, various centers are implementing innovative ways to address these infrastructure challenges, such as the Langley 20-year revitalization plan to right-size the center's facilities and bring about greater efficiencies. Despite these efforts, NASA will continue to face challenges with right-sizing its infrastructure as long as it does not have a coherent and consistent roadmap for exploration. Since 2005, Congress has provided consistent guidance on how NASA should develop such a roadmap, as well as the necessary funding on a go-as-you-can-pay basis. Despite our efforts, OMB and the recent administration have chosen to divert resources from exploration to other efforts. The President's 2009 cut of $1 billion from the exploration budget and the roughly 45% increase in the Earth science budget since 2007 are just a few examples. Until the administration allows NASA to develop a coherent exploration strategy rather than pushing NASA toward costly, complex, and controversial distractions such as the administration's asteroid proposals, NASA will never know what infrastructure and facilities it actually needs. Setting aside this issue, I believe there are things that the administration and Congress can do to allow NASA to better manage its facilities. NASA already has authorities to enter into enhanced use lease agreements to maintain underutilized infrastructure, Space Act agreements, traditional leases, and various other incentives. I hope the witnesses will be able to discuss how NASA is using these existing authorities. Are they being fully utilized? And does NASA have robust policies to determine which authority should be used for each facility? And whether agency oversight is sufficient to ensure fairness and protect taxpayer equities. In addition to existing authorities, NASA and stakeholders have recommended various additional authorities such as conveyance authority, expanded enhanced use lease, the establishment of a capital fund, and enhanced authority to cooperate with the commercial launch sector. While these proposals are promising, I believe that they must be accompanied by strong oversight provisions to ensure that taxpayer investments are protected. While the NASA Authorization Act of 2013 funds key NASA missions, maintains infrastructure, and even increases funding for center management and operations, it does not attempt to solve all of the agency's complex infrastructure issues. Instead, we have allowed time for opportunities such as this hearing to gain a better understanding of NASA's challenges and options. I hope that the insights we gain today will be useful as we move forward with the NASA Authorization Act. I would be remiss if I did not mention the intense amount of interest that members and stakeholders have in NASA's infrastructure. This is exhibited by the recent debates surrounding the Kennedy Space Center's Launch Complex 39A, the Shuttle Landing Facility, and the Shiloh site, as well as the Johnson Space Center's ArcJet, cleanup of the Santa Susana site, test stand use at Stennis Space Center, as well as Hangar 1 and Moffett Field at Ames Research Center, to mention just a few. I know many members have opinions on these topics that directly impact their districts. I look forward to working with my colleagues, as well as NASA and the administration, to tackle these challenges. With that, I yield to the ranking member, the gentlewoman, Ms. Brownlee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's hearing to review NASA's infrastructure and facilities, and welcome to our witnesses. Ranking Member Edwards had another commitment this morning and has asked me to sit in her chair, and I request that her prepared statement be entered into the record. Ranking Member Edwards and I share the same passion for ensuring that NASA has a productive and inspiring future. However, a strong and vibrant space program requires that we provide NASA with adequate resources, including the R&D tools and facilities it needs to accomplish its challenging missions and cutting-edge research. I am concerned about the state of the agency's facilities and infrastructure. The fact that NASA's facilities are aging should come as no surprise. Many were built during and before the Apollo era. Today, challenged by both declining funding and an uncertain budgetary environment, NASA is trying to make do with what it is given. In that regard, I am especially concerned about adequately funding NASA's Environmental Compliance and Restoration Program, which is responsible for cleaning up hazardous materials and wastes that have been released to the surface or groundwater at NASA installations, NASA-owned industrial plants supporting NASA activities, current or former sites where NASA operations have contributed to environmental problems, and other sites where the agency is legally obligated to address hazardous pollutants. According to NASA's fiscal year 2014 budget request, one of the projects planned includes investigation and cleanup of contaminated groundwater, soils, and demolition at Santa Susana Field Laboratory in accordance with a consent order with the state of California. This and other planned environmental compliance restoration activities have been the result of painstaking negotiations between NASA and several states. That is why I hope to learn more about the status of NASA's actions at Santa Susana and about what is needed to address NASA's other long-standing facilities and infrastructure challenges. NASA's successes are a shining light of inspiration and accomplishment for our youth and our nation, and I want to ensure that we enable NASA to continue to fill that role in the coming years. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Brownlee. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. If there are members who wish to submit additional, at this time I would like to introduce our panel of witnesses. Our first witness is the Honorable Paul Martin, the Inspector General of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Our second witness is Mr. Richard Keegan, NASA's Associate Deputy Administrator. As our witnesses should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes each, after which members of the committee have 5 minutes each to ask questions. Your written testimony will be included in the record of the hearing. I now recognize our first witness, Mr. Martin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Palazzo, Congresswoman Brownlee, and members of the subcommittee. The Office of Inspector General welcomes this opportunity to discuss the challenges facing NASA with respect to its aging infrastructure and antiquated facilities. Over the past 3 years, we've issued 10 audits examining many of NASA's most pressing infrastructure-related issues. In my remarks this morning, I will focus primarily on our February audit that assessed NASA's efforts to reduce its unneeded infrastructure. As mentioned, NASA is the 9th largest federal government property holder, controlling approximately 4,900 buildings and structures, more than 80% of which are over 40 years old and beyond their design life. However, NASA has not been able to properly fund required maintenance for its facilities and estimates its deferred maintenance cost at $2.3 billion. In our February audit, we identified 33 facilities, wind tunnels, test stands, thermal vacuum chambers, airfields, and launch infrastructure that NASA was not fully utilizing or for which managers could not identify a future mission use. These facilities cost more than $43 million to maintain in 2011 alone. The need for these facilities has declined as a result of their poor condition, changes in NASA's mission, and the advent of alternative testing methods. We've found that NASA's attempts over the years to address its infrastructure problems have met with limited success. our audit identified 4 reasons why. First, fluctuating and uncertain requirements. Changes to national space policy initiated by the President and Congress have increased the difficulty of determining which facilities NASA needs. For example, NASA's human exploration mission has transitioned from the Space Shuttle program to the Constellation program to the Space Launch System in just 6 years. Because decisions about whether to retain specific facilities depends heavily upon the missions NASA undertakes, frequent changes to these missions complicates the agency's efforts to manage its infrastructure. A recent example is the A3 test stand at Stennis, which was constructed to accommodate special testing requirements for the J2X engine. When Constellation was canceled in 2010, the test stand was approximately 65% complete. Because neither the Space Launch System nor any other existing or planned NASA program requires the A3's capabilities, NASA plans to mothball the $350 million test stand later this month once it's completed. Even so, maintenance costs for the mothballed stand may reach $1.5 million annually. Second, agency culture and business practices. Historically, NASA has practiced a decentralized approach to managing its infrastructure, leading centers to compete for work from the agency's major programs. A keep-it-in-case-you-might-need-it culture has led centers to either build or preserve facilities that duplicate capabilities elsewhere in the agency. For example, NASA currently has 36 wind tunnels at 5 centers, 35 rocket test stands at 6 sites, and 40 large thermal vacuum chambers at 7 locations. Third, political pressure. The political context in which NASA operates often impedes its efforts to reduce infrastructure. During our review, we noted several examples where political leaders intervened in NASA's plans to close or consolidate agency facilities. For example, members of Congress opposed NASA's decision to consolidate ArcJet operations at Ames, and in another matter, argued against NASA's efforts to relinquish control of Hangar 1 at Moffett Field. While input from federal, state, and local officials is not unique to NASA, such pressure creates additional difficulties as the agency seeks to manage its aging infrastructure. And finally, inadequate funding. Disposing of facilities that NASA no longer needs is not without costs, and in many instances requires environmental remediation. For example, under the terms of its current agreement with California, NASA estimates that the environmental cleanup at its Santa Susana Field Laboratory will cost more than $200 million. Consequently, NASA's ability to reduce its infrastructure depends on funding for cleanup and other costs associated with demolition and disposal. NASA officials readily acknowledge that the agency has more infrastructure than it needs to carry out current and planned missions. And to its credit, NASA has a series of initiatives underway that we believe are positive steps toward right-sizing its real property footprint. However, many of these efforts are in the early stages, and their ultimate success remains unclear. In the end, NASA's best efforts to reduce its excess facilities may be insufficient to overcome the cultural and political obstacles that have impeded past efforts. Accordingly, an outside process similar to the DoD's Base Realignment and Closure Commission may be needed to help make the difficult but necessary infrastructure decisions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. I now recognize our next witness, Mr. Keegan, for 5 minutes.
Chairman Palazzo and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss NASA's continuing efforts to balance and align the agency's infrastructure goals with today's evolving mission requirements. Every day, NASA scientists and engineers achieve tremendous advances in the areas of human spaceflight, earth science, aeronautics research, and space technology, inspiring people worldwide. These achievements would not be possible without access to reliable and cost-effective physical infrastructure capabilities located across the country at NASA's 10 centers and their associated facilities. NASA takes seriously its responsibility to be an effective steward of these capabilities, ensuring they are effective and available as needed for our current and future missions. Like other federal agencies, NASA is challenged with managing the significant needs of an aging physical infrastructure portfolio within a budget environment that can be difficult to predict. NASA's infrastructure was largely constructed during or before the Apollo era. While our facilities are generally well designed and constructed, age and changing mission requirements have affected the resilience and usefulness of many of our facilities. Yet, in spite of these challenges, NASA continues to make significant progress on achieving our overarching facility strategy. For example, each NASA center has one or more major facility replacement projects underway at the planning, design, or construction stage. NASA is pursuing public and private sector utilization opportunities for assets that are excess to its needs. An example is the recent agreement between NASA and Space Florida for the use of Orbital Processing Facility 3 at Kennedy Space Center. Another such opportunity is the ongoing competition regarding Kennedy's Launch Complex 39A. Given that this is an ongoing competition, it would be inappropriate for me to comment further on this particular matter today. Agency deferred maintenance, an estimate of the essential but unfunded maintenance work necessary to bring all facilities up to standards, has decreased by 5.7% since 2011. Utility system replacement projects at our NASA centers are underway, reducing the risk of major utility failures that could impact agency operations, and the number of real property assets owned and maintained by NASA continues to decrease, thereby freeing up infrastructure dollars for other projects. NASA estimates that it will reduce administrative space by another 256,000 square feet by the year 2015 via demolition, transfer, or lease termination. Today, NASA's infrastructure decisions are guided by an agency facilities strategy defined in 2009, along with a 20-year agency master plan that informs implementation of this strategy. NASA has also established an agency-level Mission Support Council to integrate senior management review of decisions within the mission support portfolio, ensuring that mission requirements and facility investment are better aligned. Additionally, we have established a collaborative partnering arrangement between center and headquarters officials in order to ensure facility strategic goals are realistic based on budget availability. In July 2012, NASA stood up a Technical Capability Assessment Team, or TCAT, under the leadership of the Associate Administrator that was charged with developing a process for identifying and assessing each center's technical capabilities against the current and future needs of the agency. The team was also asked to identify areas for potential capabilities divestment or investment due to changing mission needs and/or duplication of capabilities. Once complete, the team's analysis will be used from a facilities perspective to inform future agency master planning activities and to support future strategic facility investment decisions. In summary, NASA believes that our strategic infrastructure approach, aligned with mission requirements and guided by a well-integrated risk management practice, provides the best framework for achieving the agency's infrastructure goals in the most cost-effective manner over time. We therefore appreciate this subcommittee's continued support for NASA programs and priorities, and for the funding NASA needs to maintain, protect, and improve our nation's valuable space and aeronautics program infrastructure. I would be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Keegan. I thank the witnesses for being available for questioning today. Reminding members that committee rules limit questioning to 5 minutes. The chair will, at this point, open the round of questions. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. My question is going to be for Mr. Martin or Mr. Keegan. Both of you can answer. How does NASA's enhanced use leasing authority differ from the authorities granted to other federal agencies? Mr. Keegan, you'd like to start?
I'm not certain the authorities that other agencies have in the enhanced use leasing area. I know that we use our enhanced use leasing authority at 5 centers currently. And I think there's more that NASA can do to take advantage of that authority. But I'm not aware of a comparison with other agencies and the particular authorities they have under enhanced use leasing. I know we're restricted, for example, from the nature of in-kind contributions we can accept and things like that.
Well, that's a good question. Mr. Martin, I'll come back with the in-kind limitations. Mr. Martin, would you like to add anything? Because I know there's been reports and studies talking about NASA's enhanced use leasing authority compared to other agencies. I'm assuming y'all all read these and can kind of glean best practices.
Yeah, I was going to comment on the same thing that Rick mentioned, is the limitation on enhanced use leasing. The in-kind contributions needs to be tied to some type of
And
energy-dependent type thing. And I think as we talk about what are possible changes that Congress may consider, it may be removing that limitation.
Would you like to expand on that to maybe address possibly commercial space endeavors and others? Because it is limited to just energy environmental projects at this time.
I know that NASA requested authority this year to accept commercial revenue under tightly controlled circumstances where we share, for example, a launch complex. I know the Air Force has, or DoD has that authority where they can accept a commercial vendor's funding to fund a support contract at that launch facility to provide services to all the launch vehicles, government and commercial. And giving NASA that authority would give us might provide some leveraging of resources, but also, from a private industry point of view, create common business practices, whether it's a NASA launch site or a DoD launch site.
If we expand these authorities, would y'all like to, I mean, how would we go about, A, making sure it's uniform and fair across all the centers, and two, how are we going to protect the taxpayer investment and making sure that we're getting the right return on these agreements and authorities? Do y'all have, Mr. Kagan?
I think, first of all, any degree of oversight, the committee would want to exercise would be important. But NASA would develop internal procedures for the use of those authorities that would make sure that we make decisions that are optimum from an agency level, that are equitable across the centers, and that do protect taxpayer interests to get the maximum benefit out of the assets that they've funded, at NASA.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just add
Yes,
to that,
Mr. Martin,
the broader issue on leasing is that leasing is a valuable mechanism that NASA can use to help pick up some of the operations and maintenance costs. But we did a review looking at NASA's leasing practices, and our bottom line conclusion there, well, frankly, were several. One is that NASA, before you can either enter into an enhanced use lease or a traditional lease, NASA needs to make a decision that it needs to retain that facility or that property for a future mission use. And we found that NASA wasn't making that decision as a threshold matter. You're not supposed to use leasing of any kind as a substitute for disposal, demolition, or giving over to GSA. So that's the threshold issue. The threshold decision is, does NASA have a future mission use for this facility or property? And then if so, our audit found that NASA was not aggressively promoting these leasing opportunities at its centers.
All right. And, I mean, that comes back to we really need a roadmap for where NASA's going to explore next, so we can actually determine what facilities and infrastructure that we truly need. Would you agree with that, Mr. Keegan?
Yes, I think a definitive roadmap obviously would allow us to focus our facility investment and sort of have more certainty about where we're going and the kind of investments we need to make.
Mr. Martin?
I would agree as well. As we pointed out in our written and oral remarks, the changing focus of these sort of big-ticket, long-term mission focus, primarily in human exploration, is costing the taxpayers a significant amount of money.
I have a tendency to agree, and I think that's one of the reasons why the NASA 2012 Authorization Act does direct NASA to come up with a roadmap so that we can know where we're going, and then we can all focus on getting there. So I appreciate your questions, and my time has expired. I now recognize Ms. Brownlee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my question is directed to Mr. Martin. Your office's February 2013 report on NASA's environmental remediation efforts at the Santa Susana Field Laboratory appears to question NASA's 2010 agreement with the state of California to clean up NASA's portion of the site to background levels. It says, and I quote, NASA has agreed to clean its portion of the Santa Susana site to a level that exceeds the generally accepted standard necessary to protect human health in light of the expected future use of the site. In your report, are you suggesting that NASA not comply with the agreement? And if so, could you clarify its findings and recommendations?
Sure. Our recommendation is just as you spelled it out. The Santa Susana Field Laboratory, we believe that NASA needs to investigate any and all alternatives for reaching a more, we think, appropriate resolution of the environmental remediation based on the future use of the site. The agreement that NASA has entered into, as you indicated, would be to clean the Santa Susana Field Laboratory, NASA's portion, to a background level, which will cost taxpayers over $200 million. Given that the expected future use is for recreational purposes, cleaning up to that level will cost the taxpayers $25 million. And so we were laying the facts out there that NASA should do everything in its power to clean, to follow, I think, what is the normal practice and clean the site for its expected future use.
Okay, well, I think the future use, I think, is still in. I don't think it's defined necessarily to strictly recreational areas, but I know that there is some interest in moving in that direction. And but the agreement certainly was very carefully negotiated, certainly by the state of California and DTSC, and there was a reason. I think the state felt, and I certainly concurred, that cleaning up to background levels was the appropriate cleanup for it to be safe for potentially recreational use or other uses. But I appreciate your comment on that, and I guess I would follow up with Mr. Keegan with regards to the Santa Susana Field Lab and its cleanup. So I understand certainly my interpretation, and I think the state of California's interpretation on the AOC is that the agreement is it will get cleaned up to these background levels. And I know that there was recently a completed EIS report, and the purpose of that EIS report was to determine the best ways in which this cleanup could occur, and I think we're in the process of a public comment period as we speak, which ends, I think, on October the 1st. So I was just wondering, with the EIS report and that process that's going on, if you could just comment from your vantage point, what is the status of NASA's actions with respect to the cleanup of your portion of that site?
Yes, Congressman, all the information you just related is my understanding as well of where we are. The draft EIS is open until for comment till October 1st, and we expect the final EIS in November. And NASA's committed to fulfilling our obligations under the AOC. There is sufficient funding in our FY14 request to accomplish all the activities that are planned for FY14. Leading to fulfilling our commitments under the AOC.
So, regardless then of what the IG may be recommending, your commitment is still to the agreement with the AOC.
We are committed to the agreement under the AOC.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, and I will yield back my time.
I now recognize Mr. Brooks for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Which one of you two would be best to share information about Launch Pad 39A? Do you both have insight on it?
The Inspector General's office has not done any audits or reviews of the current, certainly the current RFP that's on the street for leasing. We've looked more broadly at launch infrastructure, but we have not looked specifically at Pad 39A or 39B.
Mr. Keegan?
I can talk in general terms about Pad 39A as an asset, but not about the ongoing competition, because it is a matter that's under competition, and we want to preserve the integrity of that competition.
Well, are you familiar with the accumulated taxpayer cost for the construction and maintenance of Launch Pad 39A?
The current replacement value, if we were to build a new one, just like that, is over $500 million. It's $535 million.
$535 million. And are you familiar with the annual maintenance cost for Launch Pad 39A?
When it was in operations, it was about $12 million a year. Now in the mothball status, when we're doing only a minimal amount of maintenance, it's $1.2 million.
Well, I do want to address as best as possible the announcement for proposals or request for proposals concerning 39A. It's come to my attention that it is possible that under the current proposal situation that 39A could be taken over by one private company. Is that an accurate perception that I have?
The AFP, which is a public document, is open to proposals for either single-user use or multi-user use of Pad 39A. We don't express a preference for the operational concept.
Are you familiar with SpaceX's proposal?
I probably should not comment on that.
Well, are you familiar with it? That's my first question, not whether you should comment on it.
Yes.
And is it public?
No.
The information I have from the committee staff and also from letters by my colleagues in the House and then also individuals in the Senate to NASA, they express concern that the way things are going, NASA may turn over Launchpad 39A to a single user, SpaceX, which would be to the exclusion of other commercial space providers and also potentially to the exclusion of Launchpad 39A being a backup for the Space Launch System. Is there any merit to those concerns expressed by my colleagues in the House in their letters to NASA and then also by members of the United States Senate?
I would say, as I said earlier, the AFP that NASA issued indicated that we were open to either a single-user concept or a multi-user concept. With respect to SLS, I think our analysis indicated that Pad 39B is more than sufficient under any reasonable scenario to fully meet the requirements of SLS. As a matter of fact, it won't fully subscribe 39B. 39B has the potential to do a lot more. And so to achieve that maximum potential, we're looking to make 39B a multi-user space launch pad.
Well, I have serious concerns and reservations with NASA's potential plans to lease Kennedy Space Flight Center's Launch Complex 39A exclusively to one company. If you would, please explain to me and the panel what benefit it is to taxpayers for one commercial provider to have sole use of Pad 39A, regardless of which commercial provider that may be.
I'm not sure how much I should say about this. I would just say that the AFP provides the criteria under which NASA will make a selection in best interest of the public to get the maximum benefit for the public out of that asset that taxpayers have invested in.
Well, that being the case, as much as I can, I would encourage NASA to make Launchpad 39A a multi-user facility. I have reservations about the potential adverse impact on our space program of one of our primary launch pads being taken over by one user, which in my judgment would tend to both stifle competition, which I think is a good thing on the one hand, and on the other hand reduce the ability of 39A to be used as a backup should it be necessary for either other private users or by NASA itself. I see my time has expired, but I hope that you'll take my concerns and the concerns of other members of Congress and of the United States Senate into account as NASA wrestles with this matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman.
I now recognize Mr. Kilmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up on the previous gentleman's line of questioning. A handful of questions. If Launch Complex 39A is run as a multi-user facility, I understand the commercial companies involved want to make it multi-user. Has NASA completed fully converting Launch Complex 39B into a multi-user facility? And if not, what's the remaining cost of doing so? And if so, can we assume that no more taxpayer funds are needed to modify 39B for multiple users?
The work to convert Pad 39B is not fully complete, but I don't have the cost figures or where we are in that scheduled process. If you like, I could provide that for the record.
Thank you. In addition, can you talk about how those costs compare to the $1.2 million of maintenance costs that you just spoke about related to Pad 39A?
The cost for conversion of 39B or ultimately for the cost of maintenance?
Both.
I don't have the specifics on that, but again, I can provide that for the record. But I'm certain that an active launch pad would cost more than to operate and maintain than the $1.2 million to maintain a mothballed launch pad.
Okay. Thank you. The rest of my questions were covered. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Mr. Stockman for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I remember when the Columbia had its unfortunate accident, and the one thing that they mentioned in the after report was the inability for NASA to focus on safety, and that the culture, as you recall, the culture of safety was not there. And yet I have this report in front of me, an internal review, which talks about safety. And some of the concerns I have is regards to ArcJet. Mr. Martin, are you familiar with the closing of ArcJet?
I am familiar with the consolidation of the ArcJet.
Are you familiar also with the report that I hold in my hand? It's called The Inability to Certify TPS Performance. It was issued March 8, 2012.
I have not personally read that.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I ask that this report be submitted for the record, and that one of the things that
Without
states,
objection.
one of the things that states, actually, your report, is that this closing of the ArcJet could raise, and this is, I'll quote from your own report, from NASA's own report, we believe the losses severely will impact our ability to certify TPS or in test next year. And I'm wondering if you could take an opportunity to look at this, and you and I could, or both of you could look at this and understand that I think the mistake that's going forward on consolidating the ArcJets, because quite frankly it's going to impact safety. That's not me. That's also, we have 2 letters from other individuals which I'd like to also submit for the record that are questioning.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm wondering if you haven't heard of this, why not? And would you consider looking at this if we turned it over to you?
Sure. If I could, as a point of clarification, I'm with the Inspector General's office. That is not our report. That's probably Mr. Keegan's report or Big NASA's report or an advisory group. So I'm not familiar with it because the Office of the Inspector General has not issued that report. I'd be happy to read any piece of paper that anyone puts in front of me to inform our independent review of NASA's.
But I'm just saying, as a person that's, and we all remember the tragedy, and I just think it's wisdom dictates that we take a look at what they're recommending and what's going on. And what's going on now is that we're transferring the ArcJet, and in the meantime, diminishing NASA's ability to create a culture of safety. And I would think that you'd be interested as Inspector General that this would be something that would be critical to your office.
The culture of safety is critical to my office, absolutely. Consolidating NASA's infrastructure is also critical.
But you wouldn't want to do it at the expense of safety, would you?
Not if there's a trade-off. Safety would come first.
Okay, well, I want to point to you that this is what's happening, is that in order to cut literally $5 million out of a very large budget, it's questioning the rationale behind that. And I'm just really concerned that we're going to repeat our mistakes. And I guess, Mr. Kagan, you have something to say, or do you want to comment on this? Are you more familiar with it?
I'm not familiar with any official NASA reports that comes to that conclusion. I know our chief engineer and a whole team of engineers across the agency looked at this closely and determined that we could safely make this transition. So
well, that's not what your own report says, or the experts. I'm just letting you know. I will give it to you. I will give you the letters. I will give you your own report, which I highly recommend you read. I think that if this comes out down the road that we have problems, then it's going to be looked back that we didn't do our jobs, that we on a committee turned a blind eye to NASA documents and said we're going to go forward with a policy that's going to be detrimental to safety. And I just have to tell you, for me, that raises real concerns, and I'm glad you're open to reading this. I will forward you the documents, and I hope you take it into consideration. And my time's also run out, but if you guys can come by my office sometime and you want to speak with me, I'd be happy to do so. But this is a fear that we're going to repeat the same mistakes we did before by making safety secondary to $5 million. It just doesn't make sense. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Mr. Bear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just register support for the comments that Mr. Brooks and Mr. Kilmer made with regards to some concern about the Launch Complex 39A decision-making process. And I'd register that I actually think it would be in our interest to have that as a multi-user facility. My line of questioning is actually going to be a little bit different, based off of Mr. Martin's opening testimony and based off of my vast congressional experience of 9 months on this committee. It seems as though we've gone through several missions just in that 9 months. When I first got here, it seemed like the mission was we were going to look for manned space travel to Mars, and we were going to go towards that. We talked about asteroid retrieval. Then there was a shift to mission to the moon. And I think you were very clear in your testimony that the first we have to do is actually come up with a strategic plan. We actually have to have a mission roadmap.
This committee has made that recommendation because if you don't have that long-term plan, if you don't have that roadmap, how are you going to make the decisions on what facilities to keep, what facilities not to keep, what to decommission, the best processes? I would love to hear your thoughts on that, either of you, but again, I think that is the critical issue here, how you get NASA, the administration, and Congress on the same page to come up with a single mission in a single time frame, and then we can make decisions. If we want to go to Mars, is the best step to go to the moon? Is the best step to do asteroid retrieval? So we need that priority of mission. Would you guys agree?
Yes, Congressman, I would certainly agree that the more definitive your technical roadmap for your mission requirements, the more you can tailor and optimize the limited resources you have to invest, especially in these large cost items that Mr. Martin mentioned. So that would help. I would say also that NASA agrees that we can also do better just in the situation we are in, as pointed out in the Inspector General's report, to do a better job within our existing authorities and our existing situation to dispose of our excess infrastructure as well.
Mr. Martin, would you agree with that?
Well, as an Office of Inspector General, we're not permitted to have any original thoughts or opinions. We're not management. We just come behind management after they've made a decision and criticize that decision.
Let me change the question. Would you agree lack of mission clarity makes it much harder to make some of these decisions on what assets to keep and what assets not to keep?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And if I could, beyond the human exploration, the scientific mission, which is obviously a massive component of what NASA does, the thermal vacuum chambers and a lot of the big ticket, the wind tunnels, the very expensive infrastructure that NASA has, you need to have a map.
Great. So my challenge to this body, my challenge to the administration, my challenge to NASA's leadership is that we need to lock ourselves in a room, we need to agree on a mission, and we need to agree on a time frame by which we hope to accomplish that mission, similar to President Kennedy giving us a challenge in the 1960s to give us clarity. Because how can you make decisions, how can you look at assets without knowing where we want to head? So that's not a question, that's just a rhetorical comment. The other thing, Mr. Martin, in your testimony was the decision-making process. NASA, as a large organization, has to make central decisions. Each facility can't make their own decision in their silo because they're based on the interest of that particular facility. Again, we're in times of tight budgets, and we have to have a better decision-making process. Again, that's not a question, it's just a comment. But the decision-making process is going to get more complicated as well because we're seeing this shift from a largely public government agency to one that is becoming a public-private partnership. And that adds just another dimension of complexity. So again, not a question, but just an observation. I will make one final comment. Again, I hope this body, this committee, the administration, and NASA's leadership can come to an agreement on what our mission is, what our time frame is, and then just agree and let's start moving forward and let's go forth and accomplish that mission. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Mr. Hall for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm pleased to be here, and I'm pleased that a guy named Olin Tiger Teagues, whose portrait is right over here, is watching, and I hope he's listening to all of this, because I'm a very pro-NASA guy. I've always been since I've been here. I asked through him to get on the NASA Committee and Energy and Commerce and received both of them back in 1981. Been with NASA ever since. I've seen some things I disagreed with, but I think they always try to be fair, and I guess that's what we're asking for here. I presume that NASA has a statutory mission obligating it to, quote, seek and encourage to the maximum extent possible the fullest commercial use of space. That's a very good statement. You can comment on that, can't you, sir?
Yes, that's a very good
You
statement.
subscribe to that, don't you, whether you comment on it?
I subscribe to that.
And with that mission in mind, I have some questions about the process NASA is using to determine the disposition of Launch Complex 39A and 39B at Kennedy Space Center. These are national assets that cost millions of dollars. It's been testified to here to construct that are historic sites of numerous space launches. And I don't have a Texas angle here. Johnson Space Center, Mr. Tiger, are not involved here directly. But these launch pads certainly have an interest to all Americans in how they're going to be utilized in the greatest extent possible in the future and how they'll be maintained in the Florida environment. So it's my understanding that NASA is considering Launch Pad 39B for its own use in the future, and is considering awarding the use of Pad 39A for commercial industry use. You understand that and agree to that? You
yes.
both agree to it? You think that's a good way to do it?
I would put it somewhat differently. With the end of the shuttle program, NASA and Kennedy in particular identified assets that we would no longer require to implement our program, and in January 2011 put out a announcement of availability to provide broad information about those assets. Pad 39A was one of those assets. The shuttle launch facility was another one. Orbiter processing facility 3 was yet another. So
okay, I thank you for that, and I'll get to that. In regards to Launch Pad 39A, is NASA doing all it can to, quote, as I've quoted up here, encourage to the maximum extent possible the fullest commercial use of space?
yes, that's a criteria in the AFP, and we will evaluate the proposals according to criteria in the AFP.
Some have argued that NASA should operate 39A as a multi-user facility given the significant investment by the tackers, roughly $500 million. Please explain the rationale if 39A were not to be operated as a multi-user facility.
The rationale would be that the proposed use in that scenario would best meet the criteria that we laid out in the RFP and provide the best benefit for the nation of the investment in that facility.
What steps can NASA take to ensure that outleases are awarded through an open, competitive, and fair process? Mr. Martin, would you respond to that?
Well, I think they have. They have the RFP, the request for proposals right now, and you have a decision-making process at NASA headquarters, which NASA is currently involved in. Again, as an Office of Inspector General, if there's any complaints or allegations that the process was somehow circumvented,
I understand
we'll jump in.
your thrust there. Who will make the decision for 39A? Personnel at Kennedy Space Center or NASA headquarters?
That decision will be made at NASA headquarters, and I'll be the source selection.
One more question about the closure of Johnson Space Center, and it's not, Johnson's not in this battle, but the NASA authorization of 2010, sections 1102 and 1103 required NASA to conduct an institutional requirement study, which has driven NASA's action to consolidate, retire, outsource, and revitalize various facilities. However, the language in section 1105 states, prior to receipt by the Congress of the study, recommendations, and implementation strategy development pursuant to Center Station 1103, none of the funds authorized under this act may be used to transfer the functions, missions, or activities in social civil service and construction positions from any NASA facility without authorization by the Congress to implement the proposed strategy. To your knowledge, has NASA complied with the law, Mr. Inspector General?
I'm actually unfamiliar with that particular portion. I have not heard that they haven't complied with the law.
Congressional members have asked multiple times through letters, and I understand that the delegation from Florida has stated their position, and I respect that. I'd do the same thing if I was on they're operated out of Florida instead of Texas. But I just think that fairness is fairness, and I ask this last question: is the Ames Arc Jet facility able to fulfill all of NASA's needs, Mr. NASA?
It will be when we complete the transition.
Mr. Chairman, I thank the witnesses, and I thank you. I yield back.
The chair now recognizes Ms. Bonamici for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses. One of the things that we've talked about a lot in this subcommittee is the importance of and need to maintain United States leadership in space and aeronautics going forward. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the National Academy's assessment of the NASA laboratories. In that assessment, the panel after assessing the NASA laboratories used for basic research, recommended that NASA increase resources to its aeronautics laboratories and facilities to attract and retain the best and brightest researchers, and to at least remain on par with international aeronautical research organizations in Europe and Asia. So it's worth noting, too, that the panel found that the equipment and facilities at NASA's basic laboratories are inferior to those at comparable Department of Energy laboratories, top-tier U.S. universities, and corporate research laboratories. And it goes without saying that without the modern and capable facilities, it's hard to remain competitive with the rest of the world. So, Mr. Keegan, in your prepared statement following reference to the National Research Council about the NASA laboratories, you state that NASA is evaluating the replacement of several laboratories that will support the agency's future research needs. So can you please talk a little bit about that effort and how you are weighing the importance of remaining competitive in the research field? How are you bringing in stakeholders on that task, and how are you making research a priority?
I'd say that NASA is very concerned about the issue of having state-of-the-art research facilities and being able to attract the best and the brightest to work at NASA. In the NRC report, they cited the Exploration Sciences Building at Goddard as an example of a renewal facility or repair by replacement facility that included state-of-the-art laboratory facilities, and we have several similar facilities in planning or in design right now, where we would replace old antiquated facilities with a new energy efficient, smaller footprint building, but at the same time including state-of-the-art laboratory facilities.
And what's the basis of the definition? I understand it's future research needs. Where is that decision coming from, and who has input into that?
The broader research community has input to it through the various standing mechanisms, but basically it's a decision that's made at the strategic level at NASA headquarters in terms of where to put our priorities in terms of the research we should emphasize.
Well, I want to align myself with Mr. Barra's comments, too, about the need to have a clear mission and again, that's critical to the work that you're doing, but all of NASA as well. Can you talk a little bit about the what's apparently about a $2 billion deferred maintenance backlog? Is that getting worse, better, or staying about the same? And what do you need to significantly reduce that deferred maintenance backlog?
The deferred maintenance backlog is a measure of all the maintenance that it would take to bring all our facilities up to current standards. It has accumulated and grown over the years historically because NASA has not been able to carve out sufficient funding to maintain facilities up to standard from limited resources. And since 2011, it has come down, and the way we were able to make progress against that was through the use of demolition. If you demolish a facility with a lot of accumulated deferred maintenance, that comes off the books, and by our repair by replacement approach, where we replace old antiquated facilities with newer, more efficient, flexible facilities, and again, you get rid of that accumulated backlog of deferred maintenance. So we have had a little success in the last couple of years through using those strategies.
Thank you. And can you follow up a little bit on the similar capabilities, smaller footprint strategy, and talk about why NASA settled on this strategy versus other options, and how is it going? And I want to ask Mr. Martin, too, based on your work, to what extent is NASA positioned to make progress on carrying out the similar capabilities, smaller footprints, and what might be the barriers?
We chose that because we thought we didn't want to reduce the capability that NASA had, but we thought it had to exist in a smaller footprint because the resources weren't available to maintain sort of the capability suite that we have.
I think the jury is still out about how successful. We're seeing some of the dynamics during this hearing here, some of the cultural and historic influences within NASA about shedding itself from a center and program-specific area. We're seeing some of the, as GAO calls it, stakeholder influences, the political influences that individual members of Congress don't want to diminish the capabilities of NASA centers within their jurisdictions. It's a very complex, dynamic thing. I think it's too early to tell specifically, though, how this is going to play out.
Thank you, and my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Posey for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm sure we've all been witness to the fact it often seems that everyone in the room knows how to make a baby stop crying except the person who's holding it. And in the interest of balance, I would like to enter into the record and briefly quote a couple of the letters referred to a few minutes ago by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hall.
Well, Mr. Posey, I'm going to reserve the right to object to the inclusion of this material in the record until my staff and I have the time and opportunity to review it.
Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, I will yield to that. I hadn't ever heard of that rule before.
Neither have I until the past minute, so why don't we do this? Since I've already done it twice, we'll do it a third time without objection.
Okay.
Thank you.
Just like to read a couple lines of it. We won't enter it into the record until you've had a chance to prove it. But it says, we write to voice our continued support of NASA's ongoing effort to quickly and efficiently lease their costly, excessive space launch infrastructure and other assets for commercial use, consistent with and against all the federal regulations. 2 decades ago, the United States was the world leader in commercial launches. Today, that has virtually disappeared. However, there are American launch companies that are committed to changing that, and we basically talk in this letter then about the rest of the world, China, Russia, et al., are launching commercial satellites left and right, while our best launch pads sit there and rot. We commend NASA for moving forward, essentially, and I think you'll be pleased to include the letter when you have the opportunity to read it, or your staff does. Kennedy Space Center, NASA, is asking for proposals for both single and multi-user pad use. People here are trying to weigh in, actually, before that process is completed. Our position is we need to complete the process. We are not taking sides on the formal configuration of the launch pad, whether single or multi-use, so they're looking at both. We just want our space program to move forward. We want to alleviate the Monday morning quarterbacking and second guessing. We have inspector generals that do that, for us. We've used charts, we've seen charts in this committee that are a matter of record that show over 24 of our space programs, we call them missions to nowhere, over the last 2 decades, and billions and billions and billions of dollars wasted because we have the parochial interest of different members trying to micromanage what NASA does. It's like a city councilman trying to tell a police chief who to arrest and who not to arrest. And I think that's a big problem, and that's the essence for this letter. A question I have for the inspectors are, and I have several, I hope we have time for a second round today. Earlier this summer, the Kennedy Space Center selected Space Florida to operate their former shuttle landing facility. It's well known that the federal government can prove difficult for private industry to partner with, obviously, because the government's many bureaucratic policies and procedures. Can you tell me what steps NASA is taking to ensure that Space Florida's success in attracting commercial business to the KSC former shuttle landing facility?
My knowledge of that process is that we're anticipating negotiations with Space Florida beginning soon and anticipate a lease award in December, and I'm unaware of any issues in that regard.
Okay, thank you. NASA has determined that much of its former shuttle infrastructure, the Kennedy Space Center, including 39A, is no longer needed by the space agency. If NASA is unable to attract private companies to utilize these facilities, what will happen to them, just for the record?
They will be accessed and demolished or abandoned.
At a loss of a significant investment.
That capability will no longer be there.
Thank you. Do you believe that NASA has the legal authority it needs to expeditiously deal with their excess or underutilized property?
I think, yes, we have the authority to effectively deal with that, yes.
Okay. My time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Posey, are you done? Okay, I just want to remind you also that your letter has been entered into the record without objection. And I do want to just remind all the members, it's normal practice to allow staff to review your letters for the record or your reports for the record. So if we could, we'll try to do that in the future. But
okay. One question, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
There were 2 letters. There was a bipartisan letter signed by every Democrat and every Republican member of the delegation in the House, and there was one signed bipartisan. Both our Democratic and our Republican senator signed a similar letter. Are both of those bipartisan unanimous letters admitted for the record?
They will be without objection.
Thank you. And I apologize if you had not had the chance to see these letters before. I thought we had supplied you copies of them. Mr. Hall had copies of them. Some of the other members did, and I do apologize if you did not get them.
Okay. Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Vesey. Okay, he's good. The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Rawbacher.
Oh, thank you very much. I wasn't expecting that. Just one note. I've been here 25 years, and people ask me, what is the thing that you're the proudest of that you've accomplished in Congress? Now, with Ralph, he's been here a lot longer and had a lot more accomplishments than I have. So so it doesn't take me a long time to figure out what it is that I'm most proud of. And one of the things I'm most proud of is that I am the author of this Commercial Space Act of 2004. And I think that bill, that piece of legislation, has done more to change America for the better than anything that I've done in 25 years. Now, my Democratic colleagues wouldn't be surprised that that's the only thing that I'm lauding right now. But the fact is that we all work together, and this is the great thing about this committee, is that we do work together, and Democrats and Republicans, and try to get things done for because we believe in space, but we also believe in science and technology as an energy source for our country to improve its condition and the condition of our people. If America is to remain the leading nation, or at least a leading nation in space, we must ensure that the energy and the creativity of the American commercial space industry is brought into to play in a big way, to the degree that we have not laid the foundation so that the creative genius and investment by people in the private sector can take place. Well, we will be limiting America's role and America's leadership in space. So that's one of the things that we're talking about, facilities. It's really important that we use our facilities in a way that are maximized, that are going to maximize bringing in private sector involvement and investment, especially if we're talking about assets that are now not being used and are not likely to be used by NASA. Now we have some, let me just note, I know that there's a controversy about this Space Pad 39A. And I'll just say this, that we need, right now, we need to make sure that whatever decision is made, it's going to make sure that that asset is put to use for as soon as possible, for as long as possible, in producing a service or producing an activity that will benefit our people. And we've got people in the private sector who want to use that. If it is determined that they are going, that one decision will mean that that pad is not being used, well, we shouldn't make that decision. If it's a decision that that's going to say it's going to be used right away and it's going to be put to use as soon as possible, well, that's a decision that we should be doing. We shouldn't be, and that's just my advice. That was the spirit behind that bill of the Commercial Space Act, is let's get as many people involved in investing in space and space activities as we can, and as soon as we can. So that's my bit of advice on how to solve that problem. I'm not being specific because I don't have the wisdom to go through all of the paperwork to make that determination. But I would say that it should be based on that concept, and also it should be based not on a philosophy, but on what practically will have that impact. I think I'm going to leave it at that. I would yield my friend Mr. Stockman 60 seconds. All right, for the
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, as a follow-up to my questions to Mr. Richard Keegan, on the safety concerns of the internal NASA report, I would ask that part of my questions, for the record, for the NASA Chief of Safety and Missions Assurance, address the concerns in response to the committee, and understand the safety is not necessarily Mr. Keegan's job, but is in the NASA's witness before us today. So I ask that that follow-up occur, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
And I would say that our administrator has told us safety is every one of our jobs.
So you can go on the record that you will show this to the head of the safety?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And my time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you. At this time, we do have a little time before votes are going to be called. They're estimating it's going to be at 10:50. There's, I believe, some members that said they would like to ask a few more questions. So, if you don't mind, we'll go into a second round. All right. This time, we'll go into a second round of questions. Just real quick, Mr. Keegan, how does NASA decide if a facility is underutilized? And some of the follow-up aspects of your answer include the standard criteria that would be used. What is the process for making such a determination? And, of course, what type of oversight provisions exist to ensure that this process is not manipulated or taken advantage of?
It's, first of all, an open agency discussion with all the relevant stakeholders taking place. But utilization is measured based on a facility's capacity versus the actual activity that takes place in that facility during a period of time. So if a test stand is available, but it's only used, 50% of the time that it's available for testing, you would just say that's underutilized. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's excess. If that facility has a unique capability that's critical to NASA, we need to keep it. And we would strive to increase the level of utilization to spread the fixed costs, but it doesn't mean we can somehow excess it. I think in general that's responsive to your question.
Mr. Martin, do you have anything to add?
Not too much to add, no, not to that. Okay. The criteria that the agency uses to identify what is excess. I mean, there are test stands, as Mr. Keegan indicated, that may be used once a year, just given the, the current human exploration or rocket development program. And that's underutilized, but if you only need to use it once a year, you have to have that capacity when you need it.
Good response. How about from an oversight controls standpoint?
Well, I mean, what we have is, and we discussed it in our testimony, is you have redundancies, I think unnecessary redundancies among many of the centers, because historically they've competed for work. I mean, there used to be a philosophy just a handful of years ago about sustaining 10 healthy centers. That is partitioning the work at that time in the Constellation program among all the centers to keep them busy. Well, Constellation sort of is no more, and clearly from an infrastructure perspective, NASA does not have, unfortunately, 10 healthy centers. I'm not sure from an infrastructure standpoint, NASA has a single healthy center.
That's some good one questions. Well, I appreciate that comment, but I think it comes back to what the stark reality is, that we need a roadmap to exploration. So these centers can actually judge their infrastructure, judge their facilities, and so going forward, that they can actually know, are they going to be utilizing those assets in the future? Because, it was mentioned that people like to hold on to their facilities and hold on to their assets because they don't know what's going to be tomorrow because of the massive amount of uncertainty. And I think this committee has, will agree with that because it's been mentioned several times. So at this time, I will recognize Ms. Brownlee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Keegan wanted to follow up with Ms. Bonamici's line of questioning around the deferred maintenance backlog, and clearly that's a backlog that this significant is going to impede construction and maintenance and operations budgets. But I wanted to follow up with the question that if budgets remain at the current level, how much progress do you think in the next 5 to 10 years could NASA expect to make on its goal that was stated in the agency master plan of having 62% of NASA's assets be under 40 years old by 2055?
Clearly, our ability to make progress against that strategic goal is limited by the resources that are available to accomplish it. So we would still be shooting at the same goal, but it would take us that much longer to get there.
So, if you had to kind of reconcile things based on the current level of budgeting, you couldn't predict what it might look like 5 to 10 years out?
It would, not certainly in the moment, and it would be very difficult anyway, because we would have to, I think, go back and revisit the assumptions then about the amount of infrastructure we would have, and could we do anything to affect that and so forth.
Okay. And then following up on that, if current trends, continue, I fear that NASA will reach a point of mediocrity, and due to the condition, age, and the capabilities of the facilities. In your opinion, how far away from that point do you think we are?
My opinion, I believe and I hope that we're a long way away, and we have a dedicated group of employees and leaders trying to figure out innovative ways to address sort of these difficult issues and complex issues that would allow us to make better progress even in a resource-constrained environment.
Well, thank you. I think I certainly believe, and I know the ranking member also believes, the importance of investing in NASA and enabling the agency to carry out a 21st century space program. And on the other hand, I think that given where the budget is and so forth, it may be worthwhile for us to be looking at least to know what a Plan B might look like with with budgets as they are and what it might look like, so that we can, I think, better evaluate a future direction.
Thank you.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Boozy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In your written testimony, you said that the agency will continue to conduct
and operate only those assets required to conduct its programs, maintain core capabilities, and meet national responsibilities. And yet NASA's own IG report earlier this year noted that the agency has historically maintained unused facilities for a decade or more, and that it is an institutional problem. How do you see this culture being changed at NASA so that their 10 research centers will manage their infrastructure in a coordinated fashion?
As the Inspector General also pointed out, it is a complex problem to address, and sometimes there are differences of opinion about whether a capability may be needed at some time in the future or not. As an example, some of the facilities mentioned in the Inspector General's report, some have been demolished, some have been abandoned or mothballed, but others are currently active again because requirements have emerged to use the capabilities in those facilities. And so there is some difficulty, and a lot of this is based on judgment and prediction of what might be required. I would say that with we created the Mission Support Council at the agency level in order to provide some kind of agency-wide strategy and optimization of these types of decisions. It's not just managed at the local level. And we have active teamwork with all the center directors and relevant agency managers to make sure we make decisions in the best interest of the agency. But it is a problem that we have to wrestle with and make better progress against.
Okay, thank you. Buried deep in the appendices of the IG's report was a reference to a recent change we made which allowed DOD to work with contractors on property that they don't have a use for, and which would be to the mutual benefit of the taxpayer. I was delighted to see that there, and I would just like to encourage you to share with our staff the benefits of allowing NASA to do that. I think it would be much more effectively, and I think our taxpayers would be much better served, and it would probably make a whole lot of people a lot more comfortable, reduce a lot of bureaucracy, and every American would benefit. What is, same question for each of you, the single best action that you believe Congress could take to improve our space program?
I think I would defer that to my administrator.
I think my answer would be to come together on the broad overall mission for NASA, not just human exploration, but science, aeronautics, if it's even possible to come together and then to fully fund that mission. Because for far too long, NASA has been asked to do too many things with not enough funds. And then we have hearings, important hearings like this, but discussions like this. So identify the missions, plural, fully fund those missions over the long term. And I think that's the best thing that could happen.
Well, I think that is the heartfelt wish of everybody on this committee on both sides of the aisle. The only time that ever gets a little bit difficult, I think, is when we try and all agree on what exactly those missions are, and we try and convince the other 430 members that aren't in here of the necessity of fully funding it, the residual benefits that every American receives from our space program. But I appreciate your comments, and if you get more developed through the flow chart, and I'd appreciate you sharing those with us as well. Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. I I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have additional questions for you, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and written questions from members. The witnesses are excused, and this hearing is adjourned. The Subcommittee on Space will come to order. Good morning. Welcome to today's hearing entitled NASA Infrastructure Enabling Discovery and Ensuring Capability. In front of you are packets containing the written testimony, biographies, and required truth and testimony disclosures for today's witnesses. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. The purpose of today's hearing is to address NASA's complex infrastructure issues. This is a tall order for an agency that is the 9th largest federal government real property holder. That includes an inventory of more than 124,000 acres and more than 44 million square feet within approximately 4,900 buildings and other structures. However, nearly 80% of the agency's facilities date back to the Apollo era and are 40 or more years old. A 2012 study by NASA estimated that NASA may have as many as 865 unneeded facilities, with maintenance costs of over $24 million a year. Also, NASA has a backlog of over $2.19 billion in deferred maintenance. In order to better manage its infrastructure and facilities, NASA has established an agency master plan to align its infrastructure with its mission and set up a technical capabilities assessment study to identify and evaluate center capabilities against agency needs. Also, various centers are implementing innovative ways to address these infrastructure challenges, such as the Langley 20-year revitalization plan to right-size the center's facilities and bring about greater efficiencies. Despite these efforts, NASA will continue to face challenges with right-sizing its infrastructure as long as it does not have a coherent and consistent roadmap for exploration. Since 2005, Congress has provided consistent guidance on how NASA should develop such a roadmap, as well as the necessary funding on a go-as-you-can-pay basis. Despite our efforts, OMB and the recent administration have chosen to divert resources from exploration to other efforts. The President's 2009 cut of $1 billion from the exploration budget and the roughly 45% increase in the Earth Science budget since 2007 are just a few examples. Until the administration allows NASA to develop a coherent exploration strategy rather than pushing NASA toward costly, complex, and controversial distractions such as the administration's asteroid proposals, NASA will never know what infrastructure and facilities it actually needs. Setting aside this issue, I believe there are things that the administration and Congress can do to allow NASA to better manage its facilities. NASA already has authorities to enter into enhanced use lease agreements to maintain underutilized infrastructure, Space Act agreements, traditional leases, and various other incentives. I hope the witnesses will be able to discuss how NASA is using these existing authorities. Are they being fully utilized? And does NASA have robust policies to determine which authority should be used for each facility? And whether agency oversight is sufficient to ensure fairness and protect taxpayer equities. In addition to existing authorities, NASA and stakeholders have recommended various additional authorities such as conveyance authority, expanded enhanced use lease, the establishment of a capital fund, and enhanced authority to cooperate with the commercial launch sector. While these proposals are promising, I believe that they must be accompanied by strong oversight provisions to ensure that taxpayer investments are protected. While the NASA Authorization Act of 2013 funds key NASA missions, maintains infrastructure, and even increases funding for center management and operations, it does not attempt to solve all of the agency's complex infrastructure issues. Instead, we have allowed time for opportunities such as this hearing to gain a better understanding of NASA's challenges and options. I hope that the insights we gain today will be useful as we move forward with the NASA Authorization Act. I would be remiss if I did not mention the intense amount of interest that members and stakeholders have in NASA's infrastructure. This is exhibited by the recent debates surrounding the Kennedy Space Center's Launch Complex 39A, the shuttle landing facility, and the Shiloh site, as well as the Johnson Space Center's ArcJet, cleanup of the Santa Susana site, test stand use at Stennis Space Center, as well as Hangar 1 and Moffett Field at Ames Research Center, to mention just a few. I know many members have opinions on these topics that directly impact their districts. I look forward to working with my colleagues, as well as NASA and the administration, to tackle these challenges. With that, I yield to the ranking member, the gentlewoman, Ms. Brownlee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's hearing to review NASA's infrastructure and facilities, and welcome to our witnesses. Ranking Member Edwards had another commitment this morning and has asked me to sit in her chair, and I request that her prepared statement be entered into the record. Ranking Member Edwards and I share the same passion for ensuring that NASA has a productive and inspiring future. However, a strong and vibrant space program requires that we provide NASA with adequate resources, including the R&D tools and facilities it needs to accomplish its challenging missions and cutting-edge research. I am concerned about the state of the agency's facilities and infrastructure. The fact that NASA's facilities are aging should come as no surprise. Many were built during and before the Apollo era. Today, challenged by both declining funding and an uncertain budgetary environment, NASA is trying to make do with what it is given. In that regard, I am especially concerned about adequately funding NASA's Environmental Compliance and Restoration Program, which is responsible for cleaning up hazardous materials and wastes that have been released to the surface or groundwater at NASA installations, NASA-owned industrial plants supporting NASA activities, current or former sites where NASA operations have contributed to environmental problems, and other sites where the agency is legally obligated to address hazardous pollutants. According to NASA's fiscal year 2014 budget request, one of the projects planned includes investigation and cleanup of contaminated groundwater, soils, and demolition at Santa Susana Field Laboratory in accordance with a consent order with the state of California. This and other planned environmental compliance restoration activities have been the result of painstaking negotiations between NASA and several states. That is why I hope to learn more about the status of NASA's actions at Santa Susana and about what is needed to address NASA's other long-standing facilities and infrastructure challenges. NASA's successes are a shining light of inspiration and accomplishment for our youth and our nation, and I want to ensure that we enable NASA to continue to fill that role in the coming years. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Brownlee. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. If there are members who wish to submit additional, at this time I would like to introduce our panel of witnesses. Our first witness is the Honorable Paul Martin, the Inspector General of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Our second witness is Mr. Richard Keegan, NASA's Associate Deputy Administrator. As our witnesses should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes each, after which members of the committee have 5 minutes each to ask questions. Your written testimony will be included in the record of the hearing. I now recognize our first witness, Mr. Martin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Palazzo, Congresswoman Brownlee, and members of the subcommittee. The Office of Inspector General welcomes this opportunity to discuss the challenges facing NASA with respect to its aging infrastructure and antiquated facilities. Over the past 3 years, we've issued 10 audits examining many of NASA's most pressing infrastructure-related issues. In my remarks this morning, I will focus primarily on our February audit that assessed NASA's efforts to reduce its unneeded infrastructure. As mentioned, NASA is the 9th largest federal government property holder, controlling approximately 4,900 buildings and structures, more than 80% of which are over 40 years old and beyond their design life. However, NASA has not been able to properly fund required maintenance for its facilities and estimates its deferred maintenance cost at $2.3 billion. In our February audit, we identified 33 facilities, wind tunnels, test stands, thermal vacuum chambers, airfields, and launch infrastructure that NASA was not fully utilizing or for which managers could not identify a future mission use. These facilities cost more than $43 million to maintain in 2011 alone. The need for these facilities has declined as a result of their poor condition, changes in NASA's mission, and the advent of alternative testing methods. We've found that NASA's attempts over the years to address its infrastructure problems have met with limited success. Our audit identified 4 reasons why. First, fluctuating and uncertain requirements. Changes to national space policy initiated by the President and Congress have increased the difficulty of determining which facilities NASA needs. For example, NASA's human exploration mission has transitioned from the Space Shuttle program to the Constellation program to the Space Launch System in just 6 years. Because decisions about whether to retain specific facilities depends heavily upon the missions NASA undertakes, frequent changes to these missions complicates the agency's efforts to manage its infrastructure. A recent example is the A3 test stand at Stennis, which was constructed to accommodate special testing requirements for the J2X engine. When Constellation was canceled in 2010, the test stand was approximately 65% complete. Because neither the Space Launch System nor any other existing or planned NASA program requires the A3's capabilities, NASA plans to mothball the $350 million test stand later this month once it's completed. Even so, maintenance costs for the mothballed stand may reach $1.5 million annually. Second, agency culture and business practices. Historically, NASA has practiced a decentralized approach to managing its infrastructure, leading centers to compete for work from the agency's major programs. A keep-it-in-case-you-might-need-it culture has led centers to either build or preserve facilities that duplicate capabilities elsewhere in the agency. For example, NASA currently has 36 wind tunnels at 5 centers, 35 rocket test stands at 6 sites, and 40 large thermal vacuum chambers at 7 locations. Third, political pressure. The political context in which NASA operates often impedes its efforts to reduce infrastructure. During our review, we noted several examples where political leaders intervened in NASA's plans to close or consolidate agency facilities. For example, members of Congress opposed NASA's decision to consolidate ArcJet operations at Ames, and in another matter, argued against NASA's efforts to relinquish control of Hangar 1 at Moffett Field. While input from federal, state, and local officials is not unique to NASA, such pressure creates additional difficulties as the agency seeks to manage its aging infrastructure. And finally, inadequate funding. Disposing of facilities that NASA no longer needs is not without costs, and in many instances requires environmental remediation. For example, under the terms of its current agreement with California, NASA estimates that the environmental cleanup at its Santa Susana Field Laboratory will cost more than $200 million. Consequently, NASA's ability to reduce its infrastructure depends on funding for cleanup and other costs associated with demolition and disposal. NASA officials readily acknowledge that the agency has more infrastructure than it needs to carry out current and planned missions. And to its credit, NASA has a series of initiatives underway that we believe are positive steps toward right